All right, hello everybody. Today we will be going through chapter 6 of Locke's second treatise of government. This chapter is titled Of Paternal Power, but it actually covers a little bit more than that. And one other kind of editorial remark to make is that I found the language in this chapter in particular to be really overly twisty. What would be the convoluted, I guess. The arguments aren't that complicated, but they're written in a way that makes them seem a lot more complex than they actually are. So hopefully I can simplify this down a little bit for you guys, and also add some of the usual comments about whether or not this is making or working toward a voluntarist system or something like that. So, of paternal power. The first thing that Locke notes is that maybe would be better to be called like parental power, but the words are what they are, and we're kind of stuck with them. He starts out with kind of biblical justifications from both the Old and New Testaments. This, of course, would have been more persuasive back in the day, but it's a worthy remark to at least be aware of. The other thing that he notes, though, is that calling it parental power would have avoided confusing it with absolute power, the kind of power that Hobbes is talking about, because parental power, by definition, must belong somehow to two people at once, and therefore cannot possibly, be something that is entirely based on the control of one person, right? The fact that it's separated by that very nature means that there's going to be some kind of a check or a balance on parental power as compared to absolute power of, say a king or something like that. So Locke goes on to say, okay, so we've established that the parental power cannot be an absolute type of power. Well, what type of power is it? Well, Locke says that it exists to carry children to maturity and generally requires respect and support of the child's right to life, property, etc. Basically, a little bit later on, he gets into points like a parent can punish a child, but that punishment can never be something like, severing a hand or something like that, right? So, there are limits to, there are not just limits to, like, what the extent of the parental power is, but also limits to, like, what the, how much a parent can ask of his or her children. And Locke notes that the reason for parental power is also different from power in society, for instance. The fact is that man is born as an infant, which is something that he actually kind of says. Let me see if I can find this, actually. Because it's kind of funny. From him, quote, "From him the world is peopled with all his descendants, who are all born infants." It's like, oh, yeah, thank you. But because we're born without the faculties of reason, we need someone or someones to take care of us until we can exercise that right or that power and understand the laws of reason. And you can't be subject to laws that you're unable to understand, is another point that he makes, right? That in order to be subject to the laws of reason, you must have a reason to begin with. This is something that I think is worth critiquing a little bit, because the way that Locke describes the law of reason is that it's kind of like self-evident, and you can't state it without necessarily, you can't state it in such a way that like someone would be like, oh, that's a bad idea. It's not quite the same as being non-contradictory, right? Like if we talk about say Hoppian argumentation ethics, that's something that's trying to work from a perspective of self-consistency, right? But this is not exactly about self-consistency. Let's see if I can find this. I didn't think to look for this immediately, but it should be over in chapter 1 or chapter 2, actually. Okay, sorry for the cut there. I scanned a little bit and I can't find it. It might actually be originally in the book by Hooker that Locke references in chapter 2. But if I remember correctly, the point that is made, wherever it happens to be, is that the laws of reason are such that a man cannot but agree to them when he is told them. The golden rule is kind of an example of that. Do unto others as you wish they would do unto you. Is one of those things that it must be Hooker claims that is kind of like one of those almost axiomatic declarations of something that nobody could possibly disagree with such a thing if it were posed to them as a rule to live by. In any case, the thing that's worth noting is that there are tons of what I would call good faith disagreements about the answers to moral questions, and I think that it's that there's a great deal of human behavior that doesn't fall clearly under the concepts of the laws of reason, whatever they might be, in such a way that it's not clear, right? Like, we get some examples. Let's even assume that we say, well, the golden rule is a good example. Well, the golden rule needs interpretation. What if I want people to beat me? Well, then I beat people in hopes that they will beat me in return. There's issues with having a vague set of rules that can be interpreted in a variety of ways. And that's why, like, this is one of the problems with what Locke is saying here about how you need reason to be subject to the laws of reason. You could use reason and come to different conclusions in good faith from someone else. And I think there's a self-evident problem in relying on the self-evidentness of the laws of reason or laws of nature to prove themselves to people and to ensure that there are no differences between people in their interpretations of their reason of the laws of nature. So there's a problem if you leave these laws unstated, I guess is part of the problem, right? Either there's a finite body of them, or there's something where you have to kind of think about it, and it's reasonable that people might come up with different answers. And maybe one of them is wrong, but there's no person there's no higher body to appeal to. And then, but the other problem with this, of course, is that it kind of proves too much, because there are a variety of different societies that exist in the world, and to say that they all operate under the laws of reason would mean that they must all have the same body of positive laws. At least we kind of lean in that direction. I'm sure Locke would say, well, no, that's not what I mean. What I mean is that these societies have laws that encompass the laws of reason, and then they have additional positive things that layer on top of that. But from here, it's a little hard to tell what he's getting at. So, the notion that the state only covers things that, only creates laws that are the laws of reason is too narrow of a perspective, I guess, because that would imply that all states must then necessarily, or all societies must then necessarily have the same set of laws, which is definitely not true. So what must be happening is that, like, good societies have laws that correspond to the laws of reason, and then maybe have a limited number of positive laws on top of that deal with property or something like that. But like, this is something that's very slippery from a philosophical perspective, because we either have an incomplete body of law, which means that it's entirely possible for people to have good faith disagreements, or we have a situation where no state in the world could possibly be a Lockean state because someone somewhere is going to disagree with their perception of what the laws of reason are. So it's just kind of one of those things that bugs me a little bit about this particular chapter. Let's see. Locke goes on to note that, like, there are some people who never gain the ability to be subject to reason. Lunatics, idiots, and madmen. And these people must be taken care of by others. He leaves it a little bit open, but he suggests that, it probably should be their parents. If their parents die, then, well, probably it becomes he doesn't say it outright, so maybe I'm going too far, but, like, he does seem to suggest that there might be a place for, societal support of people who are never going to be subject to the laws of reason. Then he gives up. So then he kind of switches gears. He moves on back to talking about, like, parental power, and the difference between parental power and political power. And he notes the example of an heir, of a king, right? Let's imagine that there is a good king somewhere who is, where he's supposed to be. If that king dies and leaves an heir who is still a child, that heir, will be subject to the wills of others until he gains his reason, at which point he might assume his kingly duties. But the point that Locke makes is that the people who are taking care of him have to maintain his birthrights in trust, in good faith, for him. They can't, despite the fact that they have taken upon them the parental rights, that doesn't give them the political right to strip him of his, rightful property or his rightful heirship to the throne. Locke notes the fairly obvious point that parental power seems to mostly dissolve when care for children ceases, when kids become adults and they get reason, and that the parental power carries with it kind of a positive obligation to educate and raise children in a reasonable way. This is one of those things where we end up in a space where things could get worse, right? Because what Locke is saying here is that his perception of rights is, of course, not purely negative, which carries with it some risks that we have to think about. Number one, we have the possibility of the introduction of new or unjustified obligations via linguistic or rhetorical tricks. Not only must the parent raise their child, but they must raise their child in a specific way, according to a specific set of, subjects that the child must learn in order to be an adult, right? This is one of those things that could justify like a state takeover of education, in a sense, right? Or at minimum the outlawing of what we would call homeschooling today. This could be a problem. There's also the possible when you start plopping positive rights into things that people haven't explicitly agreed to, you end up with the possibility of having conflicts between societies that have different conceptions of what this body of positive rights ought to be. There might be a society that says, well, you are obligated to pay, X% of your income to deal with the invalids, right? And there could be a country that says, no, that's the prerogative of the parents and private charity. You can have conflict between these two societies based on these different interpretations of what these positive rights that are unagreed to explicitly must be. This is part of the problem with implied responsibilities, right? Is that people don't always have the same perspective of what those implied responsibilities are or what they entail. and again, these can be done in good faith. We don't have to assume that one of these bodies is trying to shirk their duties or be evil or something like that. It could just be that a parent wants to teach their, a group of parents want to teach their kids, this, and another group of parents wants to teach their kids this other thing. And both of these things could be reasonable, but you can see how this could be a source of conflict between these two groups. The other thing, this is a little bit more kind of like in the obscure philosophical thing, but once you start advocating for positive rights that aren't explicitly agreed to, you can actually like create a suicidal society in the sense that you create obligations or entitlements that basically drain more out of the society than the society can handle. And, it can be that, maybe you don't realize this until it's too late kind of thing. So this is another potential problem of having a non-purely negative view of rights. So let's keep going. Locke notes that the fact of the parents raising the children gives the children kind of a converse obligation, and it's a weak obligation in the sense that it's kind of optional and kind of foggy. But he says the children by this relationship, while they're children, they owe obedience to their parents as long as their parents are doing a good job of fulfilling their positive obligations. And then once the child is grown, they owe them respect, gratitude, and assistance. But these are not the same as absolute obedience and absolute submission, Locke is careful to explain. Locke also notes that the parental power is alienable, right? He gives examples of handing off your child's education to a tutor, or even in kind of a more medieval example, once a child becomes kind of old enough to be an apprentice, they might go over to work with some craftsmen, and from that point the parent doesn't really have any authority over the kid at all. The kid is going to follow their craftsman masters orders on during their apprenticeship. So this is an alienable right. There's a section 70. It's worth noting that this book is separated into a variety of sections, each of which is one or two paragraphs. Locke notes in section 70, this section is a little weird, but here's my best interpretation of it. You can have debts of honor or of respect or of defense of children, or debts caused by like relief and support to the distressed. Like society can decide that you owe a certain amount of relief to the distressed people, or just gratitude to a benefactor. And these kinds of debts are not like legally binding. They don't carry with them the ability to demand repayment, if that makes sense. Ingratitude is a thing that can happen, but Locke here is trying to basically make an argument for treating gratitude as like a strong suggestion, not a full legal obligation, but a very strong suggestion. They do not confer a right of legislation to the recipient, I guess is the way that you might put it. So you can owe someone a debt of honor, or you can owe someone a debt of respect, but that doesn't give them power to make law over you, is the point of this section for Locke. Now, after all this argumentation, Locke says, basically, seeing as how I've shown that these two things are very different, and that there's all these caveats to the parental power, we must acknowledge that political and paternal powers are separate from each other. That even if they were together in some cases, that they can be taken apart from each other. He notes also some interesting kind of things, like, for instance, the rights of inheritance partly support the obedience of children. If children want to be part of the inheritance from their parents, then they're going to have to be obedient. The parents are not obligated to give things to all children equally or whatever. And this is one of those things where where it's kind of like a societal, like a cultural thing, right? Like, one of the reasons why children ought to be or are encouraged, incentivized, that's the right word, are incentivized to respect their parents is so that if there's an inheritance to be given, that the children that they don't cut themselves off from that, basically. But here's where things get a little bit weird. The next thing Locke talks about is how if a child is to inherit the land or part of the land of his parent, that the enjoyment of the ownership of that land, with it comes an obligation to submit to the government, which Locke is treating here as relatively voluntary. Like, hey, if you want to own land, this land is part of this society, and therefore, if you want to own this land, you have to be part of this society and subject yourself to their laws. This is one of the really bad assumptions that Locke is making. I'm not saying that, this is stupid. This is something that people were generally... I would say that they were kind of propagandized into their whole lives at this, in the 1700s or in the late 1600s. And that's the assumption that governments act as land monopolists. It is not a certainty that horizontal integration of traditional state responsibilities is necessary. For instance, it is not true that a company that hires, say there's a property owner and they hire one company to provide, defense against thieves, and another company to supply fire protection. These are things that are typically seen as roles of the state, but it is not logically necessary for these various, functions to be taken up by the same organization. In fact, it might be that there's two different organizations for, like, internal arbitration and, like, finding of, like criminal acts, internal criminal acts, and defense from invasion. Those could be two different bodies that do that because they have two different skill sets. They must necessarily do so. And therefore, this integration where, if you hire a security company to protect a building that you own, you don't give them part of the ownership of that building. And we haven't so far discovered any functions of Locke's so-called society that don't involve something that could be handled by a private organization. Therefore, it's not true, and Locke has not proven that this horizontal integration of these various functions that we usually call a state are necessary or ideal. So that would be a good voluntarist objection to Locke right here, is that there's no reason why the guy that guards your door needs to own a part of your house. That doesn't make any sense. These two things, it might be that in some cases these two things, work together in a way that provides you a benefit, but in general, this is not logically necessary. Another point that I think is worth making is that a government that covers over a land might change significantly over a generational timescale, say the 25-year timescale, right? So the submission of the child might be much more severe than that of the father, right? This is kind of what we see real governments do, is that they get bigger and more grasping every year. And so over the course of 25 years, you might find that, father agreed to, taxation level of 5%, but now that it's child's time to take on ownership of the land, that taxation rate has gone up to 25% or something like that. And this is something where because governments like to power creep, that I think that we should be skeptical of land being kind of partly owned by the government, and then the implied consent of the child who wants to own some of that land. These things, the submission that the father made, which he might have seen as a positive deal for him, he might have said, oh yeah, you're going to give me all these services and I only have to pay this much? That works for me. By the time he gets old and dies, that agreement might be very different for the child who hopes to inherit. And this is something that I think Locke is ignoring here. Locke is kind of assuming that the state stays within its bounds, and we know that even, well-intentioned organizations can often discover scope creep, a desire to maintain their hold on what power they have, that kind of thing. And so, again, we're looking at a case where Locke is assuming that there's this partial ownership of the land from the state, from the organizations that provide state-esque services. And this is something that we have to kind of be cautious of, be wary of. So watch out. This is a potential path to a totalitarian state. If the state gets 1% larger every year, well, in 25 years, this kid is now, more or less implied to, agree with the way that the state is being run, and to see the state as a positive deal, a winning deal for him. But then 25 more years later, it's even worse, and 25 more years later. And this is something where eventually you get to totalitarian government. So Locke is not defending against that possibility very well here. In places where consent is implied without an agreement, or without actual ownership changing hands, even partial ownership changing hands, are always to be suspected, to seen as suspicious, because what's happening here is that the state is basically saying, we own part of your land, but we don't have a compact or a contract that you can point at and say, this is the stuff that I have given you this partial ownership of my land for. This is something that the Rousseauians, the social contract people, love, because the social contract is basically a one-sided contract. You agree to whatever the government says, and whether or not you say you agree, you still are implied to agree because, well, you're here, that is not consent, period. So yeah, there's no logical reason why a defender need be a partial owner of a property. That just doesn't make any sense. And it is giving the state way too much of a doorway to get itself a lot more totalitarian power. So, we're almost done. To continue with the summary of Locke here, though, Locke notes that this transition of land from parent to child is like a natural path from submission to paternal power to submission to political power. Even though Locke says that they're different things, he says that, well, this ownership and transfer of land is kind of a nice way for people to go from one type of submission to another, which again is another dangerous incentive for us to allow to kind of just fly by. It's worth noting that parental power is kind of even in a way. The parent provides for a limited time protection, education, room and board, right? And in return, what they get from the child is kind of a mild but socially acceptable obligation for respect and partial obedience, especially during the period of raising. And then afterward, there's kind of that respect and care for the parent in their old age. And the thing about it is that if the parents do a really bad job, for instance, then the child can just say, forget you didn't raise me right. I have to do this on my own, and I don't owe you any respect for what you didn't give me. There's kind of an evenness here where the parent has the incentive to do a good job, and the child has an incentive to respond if the parent does a good job. Political power, on the other hand, especially as Locke is portraying it here, it may not be even or even separable, right? This land is owned by the parent, but it's also kind of partly owned by the state. And then we're kind of sneaking in the fact that if you're going to own some of this land, that you also have to submit to the state. Locke is going to try to explain why this works later on. But again, from a voluntarist libertarian perspective, we're going to be very skeptical of this, and we're going to be trying to poke at it, because this is another place where Locke is making a mistake, I think. He's letting in the possibility of the Rousseauian kind of evil social contract where you agree to everything and you get nothing in return. What we're discovering here is that what we want is for this kind of power to be separable. And that's the kind of thing that you get if you're working with a security company or a fire department, like a private fire department. You give them a thing and they give you a service back. There's a contract that you can point to and say, you agreed to this, I agree to this, and if we don't like it, we agreed to both go to this arbitration system. With a state, you agree to this, I agree to pretend to give you this other stuff, and if you don't like it, well, ask me and I'll let you know whether you're right or wrong. Guess what? You're wrong. So it's very dangerous. Locke is allowing a lot of leeway to the government, to society, to get kind of implied consent from people in this chapter. And I think this is very dangerous, and this is very damaging to his claim that this is government by consent. Because if the consent has to be kind of wheedled out by holding land hostage, or if it has to be implied, or if it has to extend even when there's scope creep by the government, then you don't really have government by consent. You have government by, the government says you consented, therefore you consented, therefore the government can do whatever it wants. It's not a very good set of incentives. So with that, I think we'll call it here. This chapter is done. The next chapter is chapter 7 of Political or Civil Society. And we'll check that out next week. Another decently long one. And probably he's going to cover some philosophical stuff that we're going to want to poke at a bit too. So I won't hold you here any longer. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. This has been, I forget what part it is, but we are covering chapter 6 of Locke's second treatise of government. This chapter titled Of Paternal Power. And we've discovered that Locke is starting to allow a lot of implied powers here. It's not quite as bad as like the Rousseauian social contract yet, but he's kind of left the door open for things like that. Again, he's said previously that there are limitations to what the government can do, that the government must, follow the laws of reason, and it must, operate based on the consent of its people. But if you read him without that in mind here in chapter 6, you could certainly say, oh yeah, well, the government can just do whatever it wants. You agreed to it because you got that land from your dad when he passed away. Not a very good system. Again, the more loopholes we leave for the government to claim little bits of excessive power, the more we risk falling into a totalitarian trap. So, that's all I've got for today. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And we'll see you next time with some more Locke's second treatise of government. Have a good week, everybody.